Hamas has released 2 Israeli hostages following negotiations with regional mediators as Israel continues aerial bombardment of Gaza. Ukrainian police are trying to evacuate civilians from Avdiivka, the scene of intense fighting as Russia attempts to encircle its defenders. With no party winning an overall majority in Poland's general election, political leaders start talks with the president today to try and shape a new government. Flanked by Hamas gunmen, Israeli hostages 85-year-old Yochafed Lifshitz and 79-year-old Nurit Cooper are handed over to the Red Cross. Their release follows Egyptian-Qatari mediation efforts. Israel says more than 200 hostages are still in captivity after the Hamas attack on October the 7th.
It's okay. Let's go. Yes. You go with this one.
The Israeli army is said to be pressuring Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to launch the ground incursion into Gaza, saying the operation in the south is well prepared. Israel's military and political leaders warn they'll deliver a crushing blow to destroy Hamas.
אנחנו מקבלים את ההחלטות כאן ובקבינט לניהול המלחמה פה אחד. אנחנו עושים את זה באחריות רבה, אנחנו עושים את זה גם בחרדת קודש.
In preparation for that incursion, Israel pounded Gaza with hundreds of airstrikes. According to Gaza health officials, more than 5,150 Palestinians have died in the fighting, including 140 overnight. On Israel's northern border with Lebanon, cross-border exchanges of fire left people in the city of Kiryat Shmona running for cover. Israel's military has warned that Hezbollah's escalating attacks risk dragging Lebanon into war. Another 20 trucks carrying humanitarian aid have entered Gaza, the third convoy since the start of the war. The Red Crescent said supplies included medicine and food. However, fuel was not included and reserves will run out within the next 2 days. The United Nations has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire for more aid to be sent in. The UK will send an additional £20 million worth of aid to help civilians in Gaza. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak made the announcement after his trip to the Middle East.
So we will keep up the diplomatic pressure.
Previously, it was the turn of Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who met with both Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday. Rutte reiterated that Israel is allowed to defend itself, but also urged Netanyahu to minimize the number of civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip. An emergency session of the UN General Assembly will be held on Thursday to discuss the war between Israel and Gaza. The battle for the former coal and coke town of Avdiivka on the outskirts of Donetsk has become one of the most important in the war in Ukraine. Russia's attempts to encircle Ukrainian forces continue despite huge losses. Ukrainian police are helping to evacuate residents.
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці, українки. Короткий звіт за цей день. Провів ставку. Питання, по суті, єдине. Ситуація на всіх наших напрямках. Фронт, Авдіївка. Особливо вдячний воїнам на цьому напрямку. Стійкість там – це сила для всієї України зараз. Мар'їнка, інші Донецькі напрямки, Лиман, Куп'янськ. Дякую, воїни.
On Sunday, 3 people were killed as a result of airstrikes in Avdiivka. Residential buildings are ruined and there are no longer shops or supplies. But despite the daily assaults, more than 1,500 people are still living in the city. Earlier, a Russian missile killed 6 people and injured another 17 at a mail depot near Kharkiv, according to Kyiv.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban blasted the European Union on the anniversary of Hungary's 1956 anti-Soviet uprising by comparing Hungary's membership in the European Union to more than 4 decades of Soviet occupation of his country. Orban accused the EU of seeking to strip Hungary of its identity by imposing a model of liberal democracy that he said Hungarians reject.
Úgy kellett táncolnunk, ahogy Moszkva fütyült. Ha Brüsszel fütyül is, Mi úgy táncolunk, ahogy mi akarunk, s ha nem akarunk, akkor nem táncolunk.
Orban, considered one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's only allies in the EU, had to face the opposition of thousands of citizens on the streets on Monday. A demonstration in Budapest criticized his government's policies and its relationship with Russia despite the war in Ukraine.
In the Polish elections, everyone declared victory. The ruling Law and Justice Party, or PIS, won the most seats. But a coalition of three more liberal parties says only it can form a majority. First, the president must meet the parties.
Bo mamy jeszcze przecież tą kwestię prezydenta, który, no wiadomo, że został przecież popierany przez naszą formację i na pewno wiele z rozwiązań, które w tej chwili zapowiada opozycja, no będzie wetowanych przez prezydenta. Ta opozycja nie ma możliwości odrzucenia weta prezydenckiego przy tak dużej reprezentacji, jaką posiadamy w parlamencie, więc to wszystko pan prezydent powinien brać pod uwagę. I mam nadzieję, że po tych rozmowach powierzy nam tworzenie rządu. No jesteśmy największą formacją, która wygrała te wybory. Nie można nas pozbawiać tej możliwości stworzenia rządu. Nie powiem, że to jest łatwe, ale nie jest też niemożliwe.
Opposition coalition leaders are trying to persuade the president not to give priority to forming a government to the party that won the most votes, but to the parties that are now demonstrating a parliamentary majority.
Powstanie nowa koalicja rządowa składająca się z tych trzech podmiotów, czyli Trzeciej Drogi, Koalicji Obywatelskiej, Nowej Lewicy, i to będzie dobra propozycja dla Polaków. To będzie odpowiedź na decyzję wyborców z 15 października, którzy jasno powiedzieli, że chcą w Polsce zmian. Powstania nowego rządu i także pan prezydent w swoim postępowaniu, w swoich kolejnych krokach powinien uwzględnić wolę Polaków.
The most likely scenario is that President Duda's own political sympathies may sway the appointment of the next Prime Minister when Parliament meets next month.
This Prime Minister will most likely be Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki. Now, he will not be able to form a government because despite coming in first and gaining the greatest number of seats, PIS will not be able to have a majority. In a next step, parliamentarians from this new parliament will be able to appoint an alternative prime minister, and that will most likely be Donald Tusk, who will lead the new coalition, and the transfer of power and the appointment of a new government will happen in December.
During 2 days of consultations with representatives of political formations, the Polish president will ask each of them whether they see a chance of obtaining a parliamentary majority. Although for many the answer seems to be clear, politicians do not want to lose hope until the end. Magdalena Hodownik for Euronews from Warsaw.
Iran has become the latest foreign power to try to ease soaring tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Tehran hosted a meeting of the country's foreign ministers, as well as those of Russia and Turkey, which both have a strong influence in the region. Hostility remains high following Azerbaijan's recapture of its Armenian-dominated Nagorno-Karabakh territory last month. Iran says it wants the encounter to be a cornerstone for improved relations. It also warns against US and EU involvement in the South Caucasus.
The City of London's CEO Chris Hayward says it's time to draw a line under Brexit and re-engage with Brussels for the greater good of both the EU and the UK's economies.
I actually think Prime Minister Sunak now has taken a very positive approach to the EU, as has our Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. So I think, those days are past. I talk about a painful divorce. It was a painful divorce. But I think, we have to now get trust back, because the opportunities for both the EU and the UK, by trading together, by working together, far outweigh those conflicts.
But I suppose, is it over for the UK, given that you have a sort of stubbornly high inflation rate, which people like Mark Carney are saying was a direct result of Brexit?
Let's be clear, some of these issues you've talked about are common across Europe. So high inflation isn't peculiar to the UK, nor high interest rates. We're all affected by the geopolitical issues that are affecting our economies at the present time. The one thing I think we need to do in the UK, and I think the EU as well, frankly, is to drive economic growth. We haven't had a lot of economic growth over the past few years, and we need to get growth back into the system. And I think EU countries are finding the same challenge as well.
Well, then does that not mean that the UK is better off in something like the European Union? When you look at the US, the way it has its Inflation Reduction Act, and the EU, where you can work together as 27 member states, you just look at the COVID Recovery Fund and various other funds that happened throughout COVID. The UK doesn't. The UK is an outlier because of the supply issues, the cost of supply. It's at the end of the supply chain. It's not just a global issue, is it?
Look, I regret us not being in the single market. I think to not be in the single market was a mistake, and I'll always think it was a mistake. But I do think that the opportunities now for us are that we have to now compete on the world stage. We have to stand alone. We're capable of standing alone. I think we'd have been better standing within the EU, but we now have to seize those opportunities that are available to us.
How do you see standing alone and having growth? Does that mean driving down regulation, social dumping, all that kind of thing?
No. So first of all, we don't want to deregulate. Let me be absolutely clear. High quality regulation, financial regulation, is really important to getting inward financial investment from across the world. So that's actually very important to us. Getting growth is about getting investment growth into the country. So it's stimulating our fintech sector, for example.
Just final question, because it may not be over for some people. 62% of people would like to rejoin. Would you relish a second referendum, or even a conversation about that?
Personally, no. I think not in my lifetime. I think we have now taken a decision. There has been a referendum. Of course, you could always argue, would that swing the other way if we did it again now? I think we've now set a course for ourselves, which we now have to follow.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Chris.